Experts Live. My name is Laura and I'm your host for today's session. Today I'm really excited to be joined by Angus Walker, partner at BDB Pitmans, which is one of the UK's leading law firms, and also James Thornton, biodiversity product specialist at One Click LCA. Today we're going to be talking once again about the topic of biodiversity net gain, and in particular how far we've come as an industry since the mandate came into effect earlier this year. So we'll be talking about the progress that's been made so far, as well as some of the challenges that have arisen along the way. We'll close off the session with a live Q&A, so please do drop your questions into the chat or Q&A box, and we'll have our speakers answer as many of those as possible towards the end of the session. So as a quick note, today's Carbon Experts Live episode is brought to you by One Click LCA. We're the end-to-end sustainability platform for construction projects and products with the mission to power the makers of a zero carbon future. You can learn more about who we are, the work that we do, and who we work with at oneclicklca.com. And so now it's over to our speakers to introduce themselves. Angus, could you please tell the audience a bit about your background and also the work you're doing relating to biodiversity net gain?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Laura. Hello, everyone. My name's Angus Walker. I'm a partner at the law firm BDB Pitmans. Before BNG came along, I specialised in development consent orders for big infrastructure projects under the Planning Act 2008, if that means anything to you. But since, for the last couple of years, I've been following the BNG regime very closely, trying to get on top of it and be a bit of a thought leader in this area. So I'm delighted to share my thoughts and experience with you.
Thank you. Thanks, Angus, for being here. And James, I think some of our audience are probably quite familiar with you from previous BNG sessions that we've done, but please go ahead and give us a bit of background to yourself and the work that you do at One Click.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, for anyone who isn't familiar with me from other webinars, my name is James. Previously worked in the UK as an ecologist, so a lot of experience on the practical implementation of BNG on a variety of different projects, ranging from like very small scale housing all the way to national infrastructure. And now I'm working at One Click LCA, implementing biodiversity assessment products into our software.
Thanks for being here, James. Thanks, both of you. So now we're going to get straight into our discussion with our guests and get their views on where we are 7 months into biodiversity net gain and the mandate that came into effect. And so to start the discussion and kick things off, I'd like to ask both of you, maybe starting with James, how are we progressing as an industry? Are we where we should be with this?
Yes, to the first part, I think we are progressing as an industry. As the ecologist, I'll be the devil's advocate and say that I don't think we are where we should be. Compared to other countries and other regions, like statutory BNG is pretty forward thinking. But what we're seeing now is, like Laura hinted at, there are a lot of challenges that come with this. And even though it's developed over, I think, over a decade now, the methodology, it still really feels like it's in its infancy. And there's a lot of different discussions about what we do next with BNG and whether it's actually completely fit for purpose. And I would say as well that we will kind of get through this a bit more, but the industry progression is primarily driven by external forces, so policy in this sense. And I think for BNG to be even better, there needs to be this internal drive as well. So accountability and like a willingness from developers and other people to address this, not just because it's a policy requirement.
Shall I go now?
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So my feeling is that this is it's very slow to get going, despite being mandatory for large planning applications since the 12th of February and smaller ones since the 2nd of April. There I've been I'm probably a real pain for local authorities because I keep sending them freedom of information requests. But I've been tracking a lot of planning applications that require BNG, and I've only found about 10 that have been granted. That doesn't mean there are only 10, which in 7 months is not very many. I've asked how many credits have been bought from Natural England, and the answer is less than 1 so far. And the number of responsible bodies who can enter into conservation covenants, which is one way of securing BNG land, there are only 6 of those. And I've also just now I looked at the National Register of Biodiversity Gain sites, and there are only 11 sites on it in the whole of England. So those are all rather small figures and a lot smaller than I would have expected we would have got to in 7 months.
Great, thank you both. And so my next question, a very kind of open-ended one here, so keen to get your input, both of you. Is there a misunderstanding around exemptions? Angus, do you want to lead on that?
I'll go. Yeah, sure. So the certain projects are exempt from having to provide BNG. Perhaps if I briefly just say what they are. So if you don't actually need a physical planning application to the local authority, then you're exempt. So if it's permitted development rights, you can rely on that sort of thing. You're okay. If it's a householder application, you don't need BNG. One that is being used a lot, possibly somewhat creatively, is custom build developments and self-build. That there is a legal definition for that, but if something comes into that category and is less than 10 dwellings, it is exempt from BNG. And I've seen a great increase in planning applications calling themselves that. Probably the one that most people will rely on as an exemption is that if you're affecting less than 25 square meters of habitat, then you're exempt. And from some of the planning applications I've looked at, this has been rather airily just somebody says, oh, we're relying on that exemption because we're in an urban area. But I don't think that's really enough information to say that you truly aren't building on anything. Even urban areas have habitat. In fact, brownfield sites, i.e. previously developed land, if it's left to its own devices for a while, then it does create quite rich habitat. So that doesn't, just saying you're urban doesn't excuse you. So I think local authorities are going to have to be a bit more alert to people trying to avoid the regime with rather poor excuses, basically.
And James?
Yeah, I think from my side, this, as Angus very politely put it, this creative use of exemptions is quite concerning for me, because I'm at least aware of the concept of some planning authorities having like a triage system. So because they're dealing with such volume of applications, they are kind of prioritizing these bigger ones or things that are dealing with more biodiversity units. So I think it's a reasonable assumption that most of the ones in there are going to be the ones that actually voluntarily tell the truth and document everything properly. So we might be missing a lot of things that actually could be bigger than they seem because they're being creative and avoiding this triage system because of it. So it's a little bit concerning to me.
I have actually seen some applications where the application form says they're exempt from BNG, but then there's a later document that is the BNG metric. So presumably the local authority disagreed with them and did insist they had to. So that does happen sometimes, but I don't think local authorities necessarily have the resources to vet every application that is claiming an exemption.
Great, thank you both. So I'm going to direct the next question primarily, or in the first instance, to you, Angus. So this is something that I have seen debated quite a lot. And the question is, when BNG does apply, who is responsible for which part?
Okay, well, this is looking at it from the developer's point of view. Presumably we're talking about making a planning application, but we shouldn't forget that landowners can create habitat and secure it and then find a developer, or maybe they've found one already, or find one in the future that will then use the biodiversity gain that they are creating. So there's two different angles to this. So from the developer's point of view, the local authority would receive their application, check whether they are exempt or not from BNG, and then they will the developer puts in their application, they describe what habitat is currently within their red line boundary. That's all they need to do. The local authority will then look at that. They may get as far as granting permission on that basis, but before the development can start, the developer will have to submit what's called a biodiversity gain plan, and that plan has to say where the new habitat is coming from that represents the biodiversity net gain, i.e. at least 10% more than the habitat that's being lost by the development. So that will have to be very specific about where if it's on site within the red line boundary, some habitat is able to be enhanced or created. So there are some types of habitat that are suitable, even if you're building entirely on the site, like a green roof counts as a habitat you could create, for example. Or you could leave a little patch of the red line area to enhance some habitat and not build on it. Then the second option is off-site. So perhaps on your own land that you have somewhere else, you can enhance some habitat, or you could pay some other landowner to create habitat. So the local authority will be checking that all these options are secured. So if it's on site, if it's you, the developer, doing it, you will probably need a Section 106 agreement. If you're in the world of planning, you'll understand what that is. It's quite a familiar thing. For off-site land, that landowner will have to get a Section 106 agreement. In my experience, local authorities are very unused to this new kind of Section 106 agreement because it doesn't correspond to a planning application. If you're creating habitat, you're just planting stuff that doesn't need planning permission, but you still need to secure it with a Section 106 agreement. And the third option is just pay the government for credits, which are very expensive. So who is responsible for all this? When there's a Section 106 agreement, it's the local authority that is the sort of policeman to check that is being complied with and that the habitat either on site or off site is being created and then maintained for the 30 years. And those agreements will probably contain a payment from the developer or landowner to the local authority to pay for that monitoring. But my concern is at the early stage where the application is received, there's no payment. So do they have the resources at that point? That was rather a lengthy answer. I'm sorry about that, but I hope it covered.
Very in depth. Thank you. I'm keen to.
What you wanted.
Keen to see if James agrees, disagrees, has any other input into that question.
No, that was perfect. Textbook. Yeah, it's from my point of view, from the practical implementation of this. When BNG applies, in my opinion, everyone is responsible. So there is a responsibility on an ecologist, but also responsibility for the developer to actually get an ecologist and do this properly. And as Angus said, they need the biodiversity gain plan, which means that you have to have basically done a biodiversity net gain calculation before you've started anything at all. So you actually have to be considering this really, really early. Depending on the project, you might not even have a completed detailed design at this point, but you have a reasonably detailed design to go with your planning submission. But yeah, nothing more to add. I think the next question we will touch on is about the planning authorities themselves. So yeah, there'll be lots more to talk about then.
Nice segue, thanks, James.
Yeah.
So yes, indeed. The next question that I'm going to ask to both of you, maybe we'll start with you, James. Are local authorities equipped to first of all assess, but then also monitor BNG in applications?
Yeah, so at least in my opinion, and based on what I've seen, the answer seems to be a quite clear no. And that isn't really necessarily a criticism of the planning authorities themselves. It's more that I think they just simply don't have capacity or the expertise available. DEFRA have done a few studies into this themselves, and at least I found one thing from DEFRA about, they forecasted from 2023 to 2026 based on previous volume of planning applications, that like every planning authority would need around one extra full-time equivalent person just to handle the BNG part of submissions, planning submissions, which for quite a small industry, that's a lot of ecologists actually, and ecologists are already really in demand. And there was also a survey by the Association of Local Government Ecologists, which was more just like a survey of planning authorities' feelings on it. But they actually found that 50% of 202 respondents estimated it to be at least 2 full-time equivalent people, new people, to deal with this workload. And that's purely like BNG. It's not in any other part of the submission. So it's basically, they feel they need 2 ecologists solely to deal with BNG on planning submissions. So at least if I take the planning authority's word on it, it seems like they are not fit to deal with this. They don't have the existing expertise nor the capacity.
Angus, I think I can slightly predict your response, but let's pass over to you.
Well, as I've sort of hinted at already, I think there's a difference between the work they do when they initially receive an application, where they're not funded to do that, unless the government have given some sort of extra funding for BNG generally, but inevitably it's not enough. But at least for the monitoring, once an application has been granted and the Section 106 agreement is in place, that will contain some cost being paid by the developer or landowner for off-site land. However, just money isn't necessarily sufficient, because you can't just magic up an instant ecologist, even if you got the money. You need consistent sort of staffing and so on. And as James says, everyone now needs ecologists who are in every part of this. So there's going to be great demand for ecologists. It's great news if you are an ecologist. Chance to make some more money. But local authorities are probably not going to be able to pay as much as private employers. So that may be a problem. So even if they do have the money, it's still going to be a challenge to find the human resources to deal with monitoring sites.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Also, if I can just add like an extra part, a huge part of the BNG is that the local significance, or what it's called in the calculator, strategic significance. So the idea that different habitats are relatively different value in different local areas is really important for this monitoring part of it as well, because, well, actually, also at the first part, like it's not enough, as Angus said, to just get some money and hire a new ecologist to do it. Like every local planning authority ideally needs an ecologist who is already familiar with the local needs, so that they can actually assess all the applications relatively. So it's not really going to be suitable to just hire like a consultant ecologist or a contractor or something like that for individual planning submissions. You need, as I said, like full-time equivalent permanent ecologists really to get familiar with these. Kind of related as well, but also I did find that DEFRA have kind of moved some of their resourcing away from their BNG like the overarching BNG project team into another project team focusing on the off-site side of the policy, which is also, to me, a little bit concerning, because it means if there are needs for interventions or changes to this policy, it's like DEFRA doesn't also have the capacity right now to actually intervene. So there is a huge amount of pressure, and all the onus is on the local authorities to find a way to do this, basically.
Yes, in fact, it's definitely, I don't think local authorities were sufficiently prepared for the introduction of this regime, either in financially or expertise-wise, and the government has been issuing guidance subsequently to fill in some gaps. Like there was one only last week, I think it was, on what custom build and self-build means, just because so many people are trying to use that as an excuse. So the government is catching up a bit, but that means that local authorities weren't fully briefed at the beginning.
Great, thanks both. So the next question turns things around slightly more onto the role of developers themselves. So the question, and I'll start again with you, James, if that's okay. How can developers be more proactive in speeding up applications?
Yeah, I did kind of touch on this already, but it's maybe like an oxymoron, but to me, the way to speed up BNG is to do more BNG. Like in my experience as an ecologist, I was often brought onto a project when you've already got a detailed design, as in more or less finalized. You've selected a site, and in some cases, like site clearance has already taken place, which I don't want to get into that right now, but it's like it just doesn't really work. Like it's not possible to actually do it properly if that's the workflow. So the guidance like from Natural England and from DEFRA themselves is that BNG is supposed to be iterative. Like you start with a high level assessment, you know, really, really early on in your project, and inevitably all projects change, and for different reasons. And biodiversity, there'll be loads of reasons that a design might change, or like the site deal falls through, or anything could happen. So you need to be kind of doing assessments at a high level early on, and then iterating over them and adding more detail and bringing in an ecologist and getting that specific guidance once you get down to the detailed design. But yeah, it's just like doing it more and making it a process that is just another process that you do on every project will inevitably save you time and money, and you'll just get really good at doing it as well. But if it's treated as a tick box exercise, like we have to do this to get the planning permission, that's the way that markets work. You're going to get the cheapest way to do it as quickly as possible, and it probably won't be very good.
I would say developers need to start thinking about BNG right at the beginning of their project, because it could make a big difference on the cost of site. If they have a choice of site, they should calculate the habitats on the different options, because the cost of providing BNG on different types of habitat varies widely. Just look at the cost of biodiversity credits, for example, for high distinctiveness habitat that varies between £84,000 for one unit, which is 2 credits, to £1.3 million, depending on the type of habitat. So you definitely don't want to be building on that one that was very expensive. I think that's a peat bog, and probably not very suitable for building on, to be honest, but there are other ones that are less expensive as well. So think of BNG right from the start, because it will, I'm sure James would support that from the college's point of view anyway. You can, although, as I said, you don't need to declare to the local authority when you make your application where the biodiversity gain is coming from at that point. It would be definitely a good idea to have thought about it by then, and have some idea of where it's coming from, whether you can provide it on site. Preferably, there is a hierarchy that you're supposed to be able to look at on site first, before you go off-site, and then finally relying on credits. So knowing where you are getting the gain from early, it would speed things up. In fact, you might do that by trying to fill in the template biodiversity gain plan that is available from the government on their Biodiversity Net Gain suite of documents. Then that will show you what you need to know by the time you get permission and before you can commence the development. What else could they do? Well, having a good relationship with your local authority is always a good idea anyway. Finding who is responsible for BNG at the local authority in advance would be a good idea. I've tried to do that with one of my freedom of information exercises, which also revealed how unprepared local authorities were. I mean, this was back in April, but I was asking who should a landowner contact if they're trying to provide off-site BNG, and about a quarter of the local authorities said, well, it's whoever's dealing with the planning application. But if you're at off-site BNG, there is no planning application, so that proved that they didn't really understand what was going on. I hope they do a bit more now. Yeah, so anything to, the Section 106 agreements that I mentioned, some local authorities will have developed templates, and more will over time, I imagine, as they do more of these. But maybe you, the developer, will have to draft it from scratch yourself if it's one of the early ones. So think about that. You'll need lawyers for that. My details are at the end. So that would help speed things up. Those are my suggestions.
Great, thank you both.
Also, just to expand on two small parts of that, as Angus mentioned, the hierarchy, there's also the mitigation hierarchy, which is a principle embedded into Biodiversity Net Gain. And the first one is the most important, is avoidance. So your whole assessment and your whole project will be a lot easier and a lot cheaper from this point of view if you can avoid loss of habitat as much as possible. I mean, it's almost inevitable, really, that if there is habitat on your site, like, something will be lost. But the key requirement is avoidance, because as soon as you can't avoid anything and you lose it, then you're immediately on the back, or like the back foot, and you're starting to be punished. So you get negative multipliers in the calculator, and yeah, as soon as you can avoid and retain existing things, you'll benefit from that. And then also, just on the maintaining the relationship with the planning authority, I mentioned earlier about the strategic significance, which in an ideal world, all the local planning authorities will soon have a local nature recovery strategy, which should be all of the key habitats in the area that they're responsible for mapped out. And also, in an ideal world, they will basically tell you which ones are worth more. And if you're at the point of creating new habitat or enhancing things, they will tell you what they would like to see, because it will benefit the local area. So a close relationship with your planning authority will also make it easier to get good ecological guidance, because they will help you with that as well.
If I could just make a couple of supplementary points on the hierarchy, as James says, does have avoidance first. What is also interesting is on-site, it has enhancing existing habitat before it has creating new habitat on-site. So it's worth noting that. That's probably easier to do anyway. And the other thing I would note is, do look at your red line boundary and see if there's any areas in it that you're not affecting but have habitat on them, and you might consider cutting them out of the red line boundary, draw a little ring around that and exclude it from the boundary, because then it won't feature in your calculations, and that will mean you have less BNG to provide. Because although even if you're keeping it there, that will count towards your BNG, but it will never get to the gain, the 10% extra. You will need to find that somewhere. So there's a tip for reducing the amount of biodiversity habitat you need to provide.
Great tip, thank you. Thanks both for answering that question. I'm going to hand back over to James now, and anyone who has joined any of our BNG webinars before may know that One Click LCA has a Biodiversity Net Gain tool as part of its software portfolio. So we're not going to do a full demo today. However, our moderators will drop a link into the chat now, so you can check it out if you wish. But I'm going to pass over to James with the simple question: how does the One Click LCA tool help with all of this?
Yeah, so the goal, or at least my goal with implementing a BNG tool into One Click LCA was to kind of promote what I was talking about earlier, in that BNG needs to become a process for developers. And in our platform, we have lots of developers who are using software at very early stages. So, for example, we have Carbon Designer 3D, where you don't even really have an idea what your building could look like. You just know I want so many floors, and I want this many apartments in the apartment building, for example. So they're really early on in the design phase. And to me, what would be really useful is for these people to already start doing BNG, as Angus also suggested. So we thought it would be useful to have the tool implemented so that you could have a complete holistic package for all your designs. So you've got LCA, circularity, biodiversity all in one place. And then we've also made some improvements to how the Excel-based calculator works, so that it's slightly more approachable for people who are maybe not ecologists. Most of the people who are on the platform already at the early stage are not going to be ecologists. They might just be doing an LCA, for example. So even if they're not the one completing the final version of their assessment, it's still really, really useful for people to be doing these early stage high-level optioneering assessments, comparing different sites or comparing small high-level designs. So especially with enhancements, we've made some improvements as to how you select your target habitat and target condition based on the previous the baseline conditions. And then also just the idea that you can have multiple different designs within a project and directly compare the results makes it really easy to do that iterative design process, so you can have your full history, this really early on design that maybe looks nothing like your final one, but you can see the history as the project's developed.
Great, thank you. And then I just want to kind of finish off this main part of the discussion before we move on to audience questions. I know there's a few of them, quite a few of them. So if I can ask you both an open-ended question, really, what are your personal expectations for the next 6 to 12 months regarding BNG?
Angus, do you want to go first?
So I go first, since you went first last time. Well, as I said at the beginning, the regime is being slow to get going, so I think it will accelerate over the next 6 months. Once everyone's done something for the first time, whether it's a local authority doing a landowner Section 106 agreement or a developer securing biodiversity gain plan, once they've done it once, it will be a lot easier the next time. Local authorities will gradually speed up. The number of applications, which perhaps have been a bit slowed down by the introduction of BNG, will return to normal. So I hope the figures that I quoted at the beginning will be hundreds of times as big in 6 months' time. I hope, there are one or two wrinkles in the regime that might get ironed out with more guidance or even changes to the legislation. One example that I think a gap that ought to be plugged is retrospective planning applications do not have to provide BMG. So it almost encourages the developer to build their application without planning permission and then seek planning permission, even though that's really not recommended. I'm not recommending that. Even if they started building it after BMG came in, they still don't have to provide BMG. That seems wrong to me. So there's something, if there's anyone from the government listening, there's a loophole that needs to be closed. James?
Yeah, I think for me, what I would like to see in the next 6 months would be more guidance on BNG in urban environments. I'm aware of a few, like, like 2 or 3 planning authorities who've looked into having their own requirements for BNG on top of the 10%, and it would be more of like a units per hectare requirement, because as Angus said, in some urban environments, you can get really, really high biodiversity value if it's a brownfield that's been left alone. But often there are really, really low value urban sites as well that people are building on. And it's actually incredibly easy to achieve 10% if you have a very, very low biodiversity unit baseline. So having a requirement like units per hectare would actually kind of push these, especially bigger developments in urban sites, to do a bit more, because it's also needed in that environment. If there was very little biodiversity to begin with, they could benefit from more. And also, like, there are, I don't know if there's any that are genuinely 0 units at the start, but there are some that you could argue have 0 biodiversity value at the start. So some guidance on what that means, because you can't really get a 10% improvement from 0. So what should they actually be measured on? Because I think they also need something slightly different, in my opinion. And maybe not 6 months, that would be very ambitious, but long term, I would love to see environmental net gain. So embedding all these ecosystem services and environmental benefits that come from biodiversity improvements, which I think is the plan, but I think it's maybe a year or 2 away.
Perfect. Thank you both. Thank you for sharing. That is the final question for the kind of main part of the discussion today. So thank you for sharing all of that insight. Hopefully our audience found that incredibly useful. Perhaps they share some of the views that have been expressed. So do let us know your thoughts in the chat, please. I'm shortly going to hand over to our audience and get some of those questions answered. But just before I do that, if you would like to find out more about OneClick LCA and schedule some time to chat with one of our specialists, you can let us know now. So if you're joining from Livestorm, you will see a poll pop up on your screen any second now. You can let us know if you'd like to schedule some time for a demo or conversation, whether it's BNG or any of the other products that we offer. If you're joining in LinkedIn, just drop a yes into the chat or click on the demo link, which one of our moderators will add there, and we'll be in touch as soon as the session ends. So we're now going to move to our live audience Q&A, which is always very insightful. Thank you to everyone who's joined so far. If you do have questions that you haven't asked yet, please do drop them into the chat. We'll answer as many as possible before we finish. So the first question, I will let you guys decide who answers, but do you need to be an ecologist to carry out a BNG assessment / have a certification to submit an assessment for planning?
Even though James is an ecologist, I'm going to answer first. From what I know of the biodiversity metric user guide, if you're using the full metric, it does need to be a professional ecologist who uses it. And the 2 main things that an ecologist will be needed for is assessing what habitats the red line, within the red line boundary, and what their condition is. However, there's a slight exception to this, that if you are a smaller site, there is so that is defined, and you can use what's called the small sites metric, which is a bit simpler than the full metric, and you just need to be someone with professional expertise in this area. You don't need to be a actual professional ecologist. That's how I understand it. James, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, the only thing I'm actually not 100% certain on is whether there's any certification. I know that there is a British standard that outlines that you should have, like, they often use the word suitably qualified, but don't really exactly state what that means. So as far as I know, I don't think you have to be like any kind of accreditation. I mean, most ecologists do have membership of SAIM, like the Chartered Institute, but I don't know if that's a requirement. But Angus said, like, it's if you're actually doing BNG and submitting it as a planning document, then it should have ecological guidance in terms of assessing the habitats and also designing post-development stuff as well.
Great, thank you. And our next question, what is the process for amending BNG proposals after an approved planning application? Good question. Angus, do you want to lead on that one?
Okay. I expect this may happen in practice, that you get your planning application approved, and then you either change what you think you're going to do on the site, and therefore you're affecting the habitat on the site in a different way, or you're changing your mind about where you're getting your biodiversity gain from. In the first case, if it's within the approval, within the scope of what can then, you may need to submit the metric if it's going to produce a different result with your biodiversity gain plan, which you will need to get approved before you can commence the development. If it's what you're doing off-site or where you're getting your habitat from and it's not on-site, then it's simply a case of changing the biodiversity gain plan that you may have already partly drafted, and then submitting that and getting it approved. If you've got that approved as well, difficult to change what you're doing, because you'll probably have secured a Section 106 agreement that you might need to change, so you'd need to redraft that and get the local authority to agree to change it. And if you've used a third-party landowner to provide your units and you don't want that anymore, you'd have to disengage with them somehow, but you may have paid them already by then or committed to. So it all gets the further down the line, the more difficult it is, essentially.
James, anything to add there?
James?
No, I think that covered it, yeah.
Great. Okay, so next up, Angus, this is definitely one for you. In your research, have you found many flat owners applying for full planning permission who understand and correctly address BNG requirements?
Flat owners, I can't necessarily tell the identity of the applicant from a planning application. But I would say in general, if you're just changing something that is already there, like converting a house into flats or from flats into a single residence or something, you're unlikely to trigger the more than 25 square meters of habitat being affected if you're not adding to the size of the building, but you're just changing what's within the building. So that probably means you're exempt from BNG. Technically, even a change of use application is not automatically exempt from BNG, but will usually not involve any development and therefore not involve any reduction in habitat. So you probably use the exemption there. So, but if a flat owner is building some new flats or an extension and it doesn't come under the scope of a householder application, then they may have to satisfy BNG. But I think 90% of flat owners will be exempt from BNG.
Great answer, thank you.
Over at the end of what I'm saying, so Laura knows that I've stopped speaking.
Thank you. Okay, next question. The BNG system, including the mechanisms for implementing it, is incredibly complex. Do you have any thoughts on how the system could be simplified to make it more manageable? Let's go with James first of all on this.
It's a good question. From my point of view, as like a trained ecologist, I think BNG is maybe the most simple mechanism that we have for representing biodiversity, because it's inherently really, really complicated. there are so many layers and factors to biodiversity, and it's very dynamic. So the idea that we can measure biodiversity with single numbers is very challenging. I think, as Angus said, like, you do have this small sites metric, and I think that's appropriate for those sites where you have a simplified way of assessing the habitats. But it's something that DEFRA and Natural England have talked about as well, is that they themselves actually feel that it's maybe too simple in the methodology, but the benefits from that simplicity come in how easy it is to measure compliance. And even though it doesn't really feel like that right now, like, that's the benefit of this, is that everyone can follow this and it's quite standardized. I think the best way to kind of approach understanding it more is actually not think about too much about the internal mechanisms, and just think of it as very literally like what we're doing on the site. We have these things here before construction. Are we going to remove anything? And then if we remove something, we have to replace it, in like very simple terms. And the advantage of BNG that way is, like, habitats are very tangible and habitats will always be there on site. So it's not like doing species surveys for animals that are very dynamic. Like, we've always got habitats. No matter what your role is on the project, you can go to site and like look at the habitats that are present. And I guess, yeah, it's not really a very good answer to your question, but I think, as I've talked about a bit before, like, buying into BNG and just getting more familiar with it, it will make it easier to understand, and don't focus too much on the actual internal mechanisms and how the calculations work.
Angus?
Shall I add a couple of things? Well, I slightly reject the allegations it's incredibly complex, but maybe I've been involved in it so long that I've forgotten. If you come to it for the first time, it is complex. One couple of things I would say is that the way habitats are calculated, as James implied, is really only on plants or flora and possibly geology. It doesn't care what animals live on the site. So in that way, it's not, it could be a lot more complicated, I suppose. I think all land will belong to one habitat, exactly one habitat. So that makes it easier. One thing that has occurred to me as a developer that might make it a lot simpler is if you can demonstrate that you follow the hierarchy, but off-site habitat is a lot easier for developers, especially if it's someone else's land, because all you do is get your development allocated to their units, and then it's their problem if the habitat doesn't get created or degrades or whatever, or doesn't work. It's not your problem. Once your biodiversity gain plan has been signed off, you're out of the picture of any off-site habitats. That could be quite an advantage, but you do have to demonstrate that you can't do it on site before you get to that stage.
Great, thank you very much. I know we have a handful of other questions, so let's see how many we can get through. If we could have the next one. April. Just give us a moment. Okay. Here we go. Will enforcement of 30-year management have any additional powers over and above typical planning enforcement?
Sounds like might be one for me, that one. So just to remind everyone, the obligation for a new habitat or an enhanced condition of an existing habitat is that you must create it and then maintain it for at least 30 years. And do note that you have to add those two times together. So it could take several years to create, and then you've got the 30 years. It doesn't come off the 30 years. But the answer to the question is no. This will be potentially the breach of a planning condition, because what BNG does in the legal regime is adds a planning condition to every planning permission to oblige the biodiversity gain plan to be biodiversity gain to be provided. And it may also be a breach of the Section 106 agreement. Whether it's on-site, that will be the developer's agreement, or off-site, it'll be that landowner's agreement. So that would be a breach of contract, which local authorities can also pursue. That's how it works, I think.
Great, thank you. Okay, so if a project achieves, say, 50% BNG within its site area, is it possible to sell the excess 40% as BNG credits?
Yes, it is. Although I would just correct the question that everyone confuses credits and units. Credits are the money you pay to the government in the last resort. But yes, anything above 10% can go as off-site BNG for some other development, which could help offset the cost of your development. But remember that you can't then count the 50% towards as a benefit of your development, because it's going to the other one. So it would only be the 10% that would be for your development, and the other 40% would be an advantage of someone else's development. But yes, it is possible, and you'd have to put the land on the register and probably have a separate Section 106 agreement for those units compared with the ones that are going towards your actual development.
Great.
Over.
Very comprehensive, thank you. Okay, so does a habitat bank's duty of care to unit purchasing developers include checking if their BNG assessment is correct and takes a reasonable approach to on-site BNG creation?
I'm not sure I understand that question. Does a habitat bank? Well, as I said earlier, the developer is really out of the picture once they've had their biodiversity gain plan signed off, and it'll be up to the habitat bank and possibly the landowner of the habitat to make sure that the habitat is created. But if it isn't, then the developer doesn't really need to worry about that. But about on-site BNG creation, I don't think a habitat bank is normally involved with on-site. That would just be the developer for the planning application that would be involved.
Right,
I don't know if either of you can interpret that question a bit more. No?
So is the new guidance on defining self/custom bill publicly available?
Yes, it is. I don't know the mechanism for me to provide a link in the chat, but I could. Or perhaps if I send it to Laura afterwards.
Yeah, we can include it in the follow-up. Absolutely.
Okay, while we're talking, I'll try and post it in our to one of you and see if you can post it. But carry on.
Great, thank you. So, do we know if the government has sold any credits yet?
I know precisely, because I sent a Freedom of Information request to them. In fact, it's not the government. I originally sent it to DEFRA, and they said, no, we're not. That's Natural England you need to ask. So I asked Natural England, and they have sold. That was by the 1st of August, so it's a month old, this information. They had sold 0.7 credits, area credits, and 0.17, I think, hedgerow credits. So they have earned a princely sum of about £35,000 so far. So that's not very much, is it? So you could say, oh, great, it's shows that they're all going for on-site and off-site BNG and actually creating habitats rather than resorting to credits. Or you could say, this just is another example of the regime taking ages to get going. Okay, over.
Okay, so let's see if, James, you can take this one. Can BNG be done using aerial imagery if no ecologist was appointed pre-construction?
Yes, in the sense that you could do this and fill out the calculation, but no, in the sense that it would be unwise to do that without an ecologist verifying it. I don't know if drones have become way more advanced in the last 2 years since I was reading about them, but a drone would be really good for mapping large sites at scale and really quickly. but it would be quite a high level habitat classification. It would just be like grassland, woodland, and I don't think it would be sufficient detail that you would need to actually do the calculations properly. But as an early estimate, it would be very, very useful for sure.
Thank you very much. Okay, does Part 6 of Schedule 7A of the Environmental Act 2021 capture retrospective applications?
Yeah, that looks like one for me, doesn't it? This is probably, is this someone disagreeing with me saying that retrospective applications are exempt? I think they may mean Section 7A of the Town and Country Planning Act, actually. I would need to double check that. I can't answer on the hoof, but I think that retrospective applications are made in a different way, and that's why they're exempt. They're not made in the same, under the same section of the Town and Country Planning Act as a first time proper planning application. And that's the reason.
Okay. So we keep going. I am progressing an off-site habitat bank with my woodland in Essex. My HMMP has been signed off by the LPA, and we have recently engaged the council's lawyers. How long do you think the process should take to get a registered site from now on?
Shall I start again? Well, you need your Section 106 agreement. I am finding it is taking a long time to secure these with local authorities for off-site land because it's the first of a new kind of Section 106 agreement. So it may depend. It may depend on whether the local authority has done it already or you're the first one that they're coping with. It could take several months, I'm afraid. But you know, we'd be happy to help. I'm going to advertise myself as well. If anyone needs legal advice, do get in touch with drafting these agreements. Hopefully, we can speed things up for you.
That's great, thank you. And the perfect way to end the Q&A. So thank you to everyone who submitted their questions. If you didn't have yours answered, we'll make sure we collect them all after the session and we'll come back to you with a response. So just before we finish, I want to just highlight some of our BNG resources that you can find on our website and also on our YouTube channel. So either scan the QR codes here. If it disappears too quickly, our moderators will drop the links into the chats as well, so you can check out some of those at your leisure. And if you're interested to learn more about embodied carbon in construction and the role of life cycle assessments, we're going to be holding a OneClick LCA academy bootcamp all about this from the 16th to the 20th of September this month. So it's free to attend. Please do go ahead and scan the QR code or click the link in the chat and we'll see you there. So with that, we've come to the end of today's session. I'd like to thank our guests once again and invite all of you to connect with them on LinkedIn or via email and continue the conversation. They're both following the BNG developments very closely and sharing their findings. So if you want to stay up to date, I would definitely recommend that you do that and you connect with them. So thank you both, and thank you to everyone for attending, and we will see you again soon.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.